Good evening, morning, and afternoon to all who have joined us today. My name is Ankit, and I recently joined the ProApp team as a business developer. So I thought, why not I get to know our learners better? So here I am. So starting with today's workshop, there has been a question that's going around for long. Why it is important for designers to understand development aspects, technical constraints, and collaborate with developers. This workshop has all the answers. So introducing our guest for today, Arka is a design consultant at IBM, focused mainly on UX design. She has worked across various design disciplines like user research, design thinking, UI design. She has continuously upskilled cross-functionally to innovate and optimize her clients' digital transformation journeys and platforms to achieve inclusive growth. So welcome, Arka, to today's workshop, and the stage is all yours.
Great, thank you. Alrighty, so let's get started. Okay, great. So development for designers. Let's begin. So first, a bit about me. So nice to meet you all. I'm Arka. I am, as Ankit mentioned, a design consultant at IBM. I've been working with them for coming up to 5 years, based in London and in the UK. Prior to that, I was working at giffgaff, which is a telecoms provider here in England. So I worked with them before that, doing not necessarily design work, but design adjacent work. So technical business analysis, which was good for understanding and gathering requirements, understanding them from a technical perspective, and working with developers, designers, etc. as well. In my free time, I like to play badminton, huge badminton fan. I hope there are some people on the call who also like badminton. Like to listen to podcasts, like to look after cats. So this is my sister's cat, as you can see, very cute. And I've also done some pro bono consulting work for certain startups or certain founding teams. So for example, Antler, that's they have an entrepreneurship program. So I've been helping some teams there recently, and I've also done some work with Hatch Enterprise, and they are basically a support system and network for entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds, so predominantly women and people of color. And in my spare time, I run a content page on Instagram called Inclusive Technologist or Inclusive Techie. So just blogging about my journey in design and tech, etc., providing learning updates. So yeah, really, really exciting things. So we've all heard of this phrase, designer-developer handoff, right? It's quite common in design. As you all know, designers and developers, they work together, they go hand in hand to deliver what has been designed into an app or a website or a mobile, right? But my question to you is, why do you think understanding development is important? So unfortunately, I did have a Slido, but it didn't work. I tested it, unfortunately, it stopped working. So we can just type in the chat. Why do you think understanding development is important from a design perspective? So I'll give you a few minutes to write your answers, or you can, if you have option to talk, you can talk as well. Otherwise, by all means, please put your answers in the chat. So I'll just give it a few minutes. All right, understand flow of application. Yeah. Figuring out timelines, breaking down components, figuring out data layer, thinking repos. Yes, key features. Yep, great. Yeah, so really good in terms of collaboration, communication, framework for understanding changes and growth. Yeah, exactly. Cool, really good answers. Just waiting to see if anyone else wants to write something. If not, we can continue. Oh, okay. Helps to understand developers' problems and helps developers to collab easily with design it. Yeah. Empathize with people who are building the product. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you've all given really good answers. So basically it's very important for a variety of reasons, right? Yeah, reduce back and forth due to change of designs. Yes, design debt, reducing design debt, that's a huge consideration as well. Cool, great. So let me just minimize this and we can continue. Great. Yeah, so really great answers, everyone. But it's important to reframe your mindset. So the phrase design development handoff, that implies just one touch point, but really you want many touch points. You want to be in constant communication with your developers and to have many touch points and many communication points, as you mentioned, to reduce the back and forth and changes in terms of design debt, etc. Right? Cool. So here I've got a diagram about the different touch points you can have throughout the design process. So I think everyone's pretty familiar with this, right? You've got your necessary and key stages in the design process. You've got discover, define, develop, and deliver. You might have seen them called different things, but it's basically the same thing. And below you've got the details of what each stage entails and what actually goes on. So really you want to involve your developers and work with developers as soon as possible and as early as possible, not necessarily just leave it to the third stage, so develop, and the fourth stage, deliver. So what does that actually look like? So in the first stage for discover, that's really, as someone wrote in the chat, helping developers to gain empathy for the users. So that could entail involving your developers in user research. So maybe getting them involved as an observer when you do user interviews with your users, or if you're doing design workshops and ideating, again, bringing the developers along with you and hearing their insights into what a potentially a good solution or product or service would be. So in that way, it helps you to understand your developers' viewpoints and it helps everyone in the team feel more aligned. But then also I think from the developer point of view, it helps them really get a sense of why they're doing what they're doing at a high level, because when I've previously worked with developers and have brought them in at the first stage of design thinking, they've mentioned to me they really enjoy taking a high level approach, because normally they're so down in the details, coding and getting their features, they think very granularly, that they really enjoy it. So that's an example of what you could do. In the second phase, so define, that's more understanding if your solution is technically feasible, what the trade-offs are. So I'm really understanding, once you've got an idea, what your solution would look like, right? So again, that's definitely a case of bringing your developers along for the journey. What I typically do is I involve my developers in this stage in the wireframing process. So low fidelity wireframing, excuse me, it doesn't have to be high fidelity, but even just explaining what you've designed, so your design decisions and why, and then asking them if this is technically feasible or not. Typically they give a really good rationale as to why something is technically feasible or not, and if so or if not, what the trade-offs would be. So it's really important as well to bear that in mind. And it's not just a trade-off isn't necessarily only technical in terms of, say, performance. It could also be commercial, right? So like business, say acquiring fewer customers or making less revenue, etc. So that's something to bear in mind as well from a design standpoint, because you want to satisfy well, yes, your users, but not just your users, right? You also want to map your design goals and your user needs to your business goals. And then number 3, develop phase, that's pretty self-explanatory, of course. In that at that point, you've got your kind of wireframes sorted out, and at the end of the phase it will be in high fidelity, right? So just a case of collaborating with developers, really making sure that they know what it is you want to be designed, but that also how your developers want to proceed. So if there are certain assets or certain formats they want these assets in, for example, images, or understanding certain colors, certain fonts that you're using, make sure that you've communicated that up front and that you're aligned. And then for delivery, of course, so once you've had your conversations with your designers and they've been coding your screens, it's a case of making sure that what has been coded is indeed reflective and matches to your initial business goal, but also your user goals as well and your designs. So from a business analysis perspective, has the acceptance criteria, has that been met? So in case you don't know what an acceptance criteria is, it's basically what needs to happen in order for your user story or for the design that's been developed to be successful. So obviously you want the users to have a successful interaction and experience with your wireframe. So that needs to be ticked off, as well as, of course, user testing to make sure that your users can either use, if you're developing something new or designing something new from scratch, then they can use that. But if not, then if what they're using, if it's a second iteration, there has been improvement in terms of metrics from the previous iteration of your product or service. Everyone with me so far? I think so. Cool, I'll move on. If you've got questions, there'll be Q&A at the end, or you can ask me in the chat as well. I'm just gonna go to the chat. I want to make sure I'm not leaving any of your questions unanswered. Okay, perfect. Great, I'll move on then. Cool, so your desired outcome of prototyping is something that's very easy to understand. And I found this, well, it was a tweet, but this person, so Mark Drasutis, he tagged IDEO, and the quote is, "If a picture is worth 1,000 words, a prototype is worth 1,000 meetings." And I've linked the article below, so you can read it in your own time once these slides are shared. So it's from Medium, and it really sums up what it is we want to do as designers, right? We want to showcase our work and our designs that they're really easy to understand, they're very intuitive to use, and you don't need to explain it because it just works. So I think that's something that you really want to get to as a designer, with your developers, with your business analysts, etc. as well. Cool. So now we move on to front-end development. So how do you actually get there, and how do you design it such that in a way that you can get there, right? So brief overview of front-end development. I think based on the chat, some people are very familiar with front-end web development, but some people aren't. So just give an overview. So front-end development, typically, it's what you see, say, on a browser, on your mobile, on a desktop, what you can interact with, right? And there are typically three languages: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if you look on the left, in the diagram, the first diagram, so the HTML, it's essentially the skeleton. So it's the backbones of the web, the internet, so how it's structured. And then you've got CSS, which is how it looks, so colors, etc., font, any kind of I guess styling, that's more CSS, so I guess the skin, to continue with the metaphor. Excuse me. And then the third is JavaScript. So JavaScript is the kind of brains, or as a diagram is trying to explain, the central nervous system behind the operation. So that's more, it causes interactivity. So if you click on a button and then an alert pops up, that's because of JavaScript. If you can excuse me, submit a form and there's loading activity involved, that's JavaScript. Anything you can click off, so like checkbox, that's JavaScript. So just to go a bit further, so HTML, so if we go and break it down a little bit. So HTML, it comprises of these brackets called tags, as you can see. And then within your tags, you put your values or what it is that you want your web page to display. And then HTML3 is a bit different, but HTML5, these are the types of tags you can have in the structure of a web page. So you've got your header on the top. So that would be your head, your say H1. There are 6 types of headers: H1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Your navigation that people would use to interact and navigate through your site, right? So it could be home, it could be about, contact us, all those kind of things. And then you've got your kind of main content, which is where the bulk of what you're designing is going to be contained in. And then you might have articles, which are basically sections. So section 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And then they would be named corresponding to the section, and then they'd have the relevant text or paragraphs within the kind of images, etc. If you want a sidebar or an aside, as you can see in the tag, that's what you'd write, and you'd have your relevant, say, text or scrolling functionality there. And then last would be footer. So typically you see copyright, made by X, a date, terms and conditions, like that they are the elements that are within your footer. And I've linked some sites here that you can see, some resources. So when you click on them, when you get the PDF, you can experiment them with them in your own time. But it will be really good to understand on a deeper level how HTML works and code in general, of course, as you mentioned, to make sure that you can collaborate well with the developers. So W3 School is a really good resource, free code camp as well. And then there's something called CSS Zen Garden. And that's good in terms of you can look at how different CSS templates change the look of the website. So really recommend that. Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, important for SEO. Yeah, exactly. Thank you. That's also a really good point. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And then we've got CSS, which I mentioned is the skin, going back to the skeleton or human body metaphor. So these are some things you might want to consider when you're interacting with developers and working with them. So the first is the CSS box model. So typically, if you drew a box in a low fidelity wireframe or a high fidelity wireframe, it's never just a box. It's something more. So you have certain properties that either go within or outside of the box, around the box. So here's an example. So you've got your padding here. So this is your box. And then you've got your padding here, and then you've got your top, padding right, padding bottom, padding left. So you can see here the padding at the top and the bottom is more than the padding then at the right and the left. So these can all be changed, right? That's just an example. And then you've got your border here. So say like 5 pixels. It is solid and it's black. And then that, again, these can be changed. It can be 10 pixels. It can be dotted like this. It can be a different color. And then beyond your box is your margin. So the space between this element and then the next element, say if you've got 3 boxes, 1, 2, 3, horizontally. And again, you can see top, right, bottom, left. The top and bottom margins are more than the right and left margins. So that is going to help you in terms of when you decide your layout, right? If you're using grids or columns, etc., that's going to help you think like a developer and therefore understand that there's certain requirements that developers would want from you when it comes to designing your wireframes and how your wireframes are laid out. Make sense? or any questions? If not, I'll continue to the next one. Great. Alrighty. So the next one is in terms of CSS or your assets. So your icons, any images or any I guess animations, and that could come on JavaScript too, but you want to hand these off to developers in a way that helps them understand how to code them. So if you look at icons, for example, typically they're say 24 by 24, 16 by 16. If they're quite big, they're 64 by 64 pixels. But you want to make sure that the developers, they have those requirements, say if they're a certain color as well, and also looking at states. So an icon that hasn't been interacted with might look very different from an icon that is going to be interacted with. So if you say have an account icon, you know, the circle with a person in it, like an avatar icon, and then you put your mouse on it to log in, it might change color, right? So you're hovering over it, and then you press it to log in, and then that might be a darker color. So these are already two more states, so hover and clicked or pressed, that you need to give to your developers, or two more, to be specific, two more icons, or what icons will look like, designs for those two states. Because the developers will need to know that when they code this functionality and this interactivity into the web page, right, or the mobile app, desktop, etc. So it's important to be mindful of that. And same with images as well. If you hover over an image, if you click on an image, if a caption appears underneath, or if it's carousel, again, something to be important and to be aware of and mindful of. So make sure you have those ready to go for your developers. And it's the same with font as well. So if you've got body text that's different from, say, a subheading, which is typically bold or a different color, and bigger, and say from the heading, which is even bigger. And when you want to click on text or a hyperlink, a line appears, right, it changes color. So again, you need to make sure that you have the color codes ready. So hex codes or the RGB or HSB values ready for the developers as well, because then they know the values to code. And then, so we go to number 3, average cases and edge cases. So average cases is basically your typical journey that a user has and will follow for your product or service or application. But then you do have edge cases, and then the more extreme examples. So it could be, maybe a user, like an atypical user, but who would use your application or product service, but maybe not as likely to, because this is very good for debugging purposes for the developer. So when they troubleshoot to make sure that what they've coded works, they want to they want to make sure that, well, first of all, it works for everyone, but then also by testing in these extreme circumstances, they're more likely to be able to spot any potential errors or bugs that they wouldn't have if they hadn't tested with these edge cases. And edge cases can also be whether it's differently abled users, but it can also be cultures or languages, especially if you're working on a product or service that has international appeal, right? So Airbnb, for example, that's in many countries, right? And different users in different countries use say products and applications differently to an extent. I think we've got a question. Yes, Lottie, and a statement. Yeah, Lottie is great for adding animations. Yeah. Great, yeah, thank you. Yes, I've heard of it, I haven't used it, but I'll definitely give it a go, so thank you. And also culture. So I can't remember where I read it, but I read that in Amazon, on the Amazon website in Germany, because the word for, I think, cart or basket is so long, they can't fit it on the button, so they have to use, I think, a different word. And if you look at Arabic speaking countries, because they write from right to left instead of left to right, like in English. So their designs on how they interact with kind of mobile apps, product and services, it's flipped, right, from say English speaking users. So that's something to be mindful of as well if you ever work on kind of international products or services, or if you're looking at designing things for global markets. And then fourth is responsive design. So media queries and CSS Flexbox. So yeah, I think definitely someone mentioned in the chat earlier that responsive design is basically designing across different devices such that your design renders effectively. And there are various devices, as you know, mobile, desktop. You've got fitness devices as well, like the Apple Watch, etc. Now you've got home devices like Amazon Echo, Google. So you want to make sure your designs are relevant and they correspond to the device that you're designing for. With regards to media queries, it's basically in a set of conditions in your code for a certain that correspond to a certain screen width, and it is basically a set of instructions that allow your that tell your designers how they should be rendered in the browser. So say if you want 4 columns in desktop, but then on mobile, because the screen is smaller, you want 1 column, right? So each column will take up more of the screen width because there's only 1 column on mobile versus 4. So that is how it would be coded and therefore shown. I think we might have a question. Yes, would designing for CSS Grid be better for developer handoff? When you say that, I guess, what do you mean specifically? Do you mean thinking of media queries, or I think in the way I see it, when you design responsively or on different devices, if you have your guidelines set out, so what it looks like, what your designs would look like for mobile, and also for desktop as well, for tablet, I think inherently, especially if you stick to a grid, you're going to have those different layouts and there's different, say, columns, etc. anyway. So based on that, your design will be responsive. It's good to have, I think, an idea of which screen widths correspond to which like device type, right, mobile, etc. And to be mindful of spacing, layouts, scrollability in that sense, and then therefore kind of the grid and the flexbox. But I think based on that, that's enough. You wouldn't necessarily have to write out media queries if that's what you're asking. I hope I've answered your question. If not, let me know. And then CSS Fluxbox is basically a way in CSS and HTML to write your or to divide your page into like grids and columns essentially. So that's quite intuitive, and yeah, I recommend it. So definitely look at the links here. So these are the resources because they give you good insight into these principles as well as others. Cool. If you've got no other questions, I will move on. Cool. And then the last one is JavaScript. So as I mentioned, the brains behind the skeleton and the skin, as it were. So again, I've written some resources here that you can have a look at in your own time. JavaScript is a lot more complicated, I think, than CSS and HTML. At least when I was trying to learn it, it took me longer. But it's really interesting, and it really is kind of a powerhouse. It's not only just used for front end, it's also used for back end as well. So yeah, it's really worthwhile if you know a little bit of it or can understand concepts. You've got some common frameworks in the market nowadays. So Vue.js, so Vue, JavaScript, React, and Angular are the ones I've heard the most about. But then you've also got Backbone and Ember. And then in terms of certain principles you want to be aware of and how they impact your design decisions. So conditional logic. So in JavaScript, there are statements like if, when, then, and it's basically telling the browser that if this happens, then do this or show this. But then if this other thing happens, then perhaps do something separate. So that will be quite useful for you when you're designing certain scenarios, maybe for different users, because you'll be able to separate that into conditional logic when you're working with developers. So for an example is, if you're on, or if you want to, say if you're on an e-commerce website and you've got an account and you've logged into your profile, and you can see your last viewed like clothes you've bought, for example, right? That would be conditional logic, because what the kind of backend is saying is if a user has bought whatever the last order, X number of orders were, show that in the app. Whereas if they haven't bought anything, then show them nothing because they haven't bought anything. So that is an example. The second thing is error states. So I think a common example would be when you try to log into an account. Say if you've got your password incorrect, you've typed it incorrectly, or your email is incorrect, you'll see an error message, or for your users, you'll design an error message, right, saying incorrect email or incorrect password. And it won't just be a message, but it would also be, there'll be visual aspects, right? So a border might be red, and it'll be bold. There might be a warning triangle icon or an exclamation mark. And in terms of content, just to touch upon this, try to make your content as valuable and as helpful for the user. So just saying, say, incorrect password or incorrect email perhaps isn't as helpful as why. So it could be that it doesn't look like a certain email, it needs an @ symbol, for example, right? Or if you're a new user creating a new account, so you're setting up a new password, your password isn't alphanumeric. So typically when you create a password, you need to have 8 to 15 characters, a number, an uppercase letter, a lowercase letter, maybe 1 or 2 special characters, if that. So when you're designing these types of functionalities and features for your users, that's something to be aware of. Oh, I'm just going to pause, and I see I've got a question. Can one learn a JavaScript framework directly without starting with JavaScript? Oh, good question. I think it's going to be difficult. I personally wouldn't, because you need to know the basics of JavaScript, because these frameworks are built in JavaScript. So if you don't know, say, these conditional logic, error states, loops, etc., it's going to be harder for you to understand their syntax and therefore write more complex JavaScript. So I'd say start with the basics first, and then when you get comfortable, move to learning the frameworks. Check, is there another question? Oh, that's the one. Okay, great. And then the third concept is loops. So loops is basically when the logic, it goes through in order, in a certain order, and iterates through. Say if you've got a table and you've got your first entry, second entry, third entry, fourth entry, etc. It will just loop through those entries. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. And then it will either stop when it gets to a certain amount, if you've told it to, or it will pick out a certain value, again, if you've coded it that way. So that will be really useful logic for you to be aware of if you're designing something relevant for your app or product or service. So an example could be if you're designing an application with lots of data, like lots of tables, for example, for your user, and they want to see something specific, like if they, going back to the e-commerce example, submitted an order for a refund on a certain date, it'd be easy therefore to just develop something like logic to go through their refunds or their order history and pull up a certain order reference number that they'll have inputted, right? So that's a way of using loops and designing a feature corresponding to that for your product or service. And then fourth, as I mentioned, common frameworks, as I touched upon here. So really interesting stuff. And because especially Vue, React, and Angular, they're so popular and common in the market, I think you'll find yourselves working a lot more with developers who have experience in these three frameworks. Cool. Any questions? We might have a question. If not, I will move on. Okay, so should you be thinking about the component library being used? Is it worth it to design them separately? Really good question. So if there is a component design library used, so that means, well, how I interpret your question is that there's already a design system in place in your organization that you're designing for. So if there is, then use that, because those have already been built with design design principles and development principles in place. If you're referring to kind of general frameworks, so these frameworks and how these frameworks have essentially packaged code or certain lines of code into usable components, by all means, don't reinvent the wheel and keep going with these frameworks. So an example could be like a date picker. If that's already there and it works, then use that, because you know it's going to work. It's tried and tested and it's very common, so you're less likely to run into errors if you're coding it or debugging it. And also it takes less time, right, to use that than to code something from scratch. Cool, I'll move on. So now we've done the front end, and then we come to the back end. So what is backend development? So we touched upon front end, as you can see on the left. So that is, as I mentioned, what you interact with, what you see in your browser, etc. And then backend is the behind the scenes type of development. So it's basically looking after the server, and then how it interacts with the database to serve up data that you see on the front end, so to the client, and that their users interact with. So you can have maintaining security, backing up your data, interacting with APIs, building APIs, a variety of things, monitoring, tooling. And I've written some common tasks here. So building APIs, as I mentioned, integrating APIs. Just to check, does everyone know what an API is? If not, I can explain. Yeah, please explain. Sure, I can do that. So API is application programming interface. And what it means is it's basically a way of retrieving data from a different source that integrates with your own. So you would just, or the official term is call an API, but you would write some code for the API to start work and then retrieve the data that you need as and when. So if you look at something very common is the Google Maps API. So if you go on it's quite common, a website, say if you're looking to eat at a restaurant or go to an office, if you scroll down and there's the about us or the locations, like where we're located, it will say the address, and it will have a widget that looks like Google Maps, right? And the Google Maps pin saying where they're located, and that is using the Google Maps API. So they've basically brought in data from Google, paid access to that service, to have the Google Maps kind of widget or functionality, so that people can see it and interact with it, because a lot of people are familiar with Google Maps. Hope that makes sense. Cool. Cool. I will continue. Yeah, okay, great. I will continue then. I can't close the chat. Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, want to make sure you can see my slides. Alrighty, so next one, databases. So as I mentioned, database, if you're working on the back end, you're going to be working a lot with databases. And here's a diagram that shows the flow of data between the client, the front end, the server, back end, and then the database. So you can see your HTML, CSS, and Java is sent from your server to the client, and then your user interacts with the client or your browser, right? And then that's the information sent to the server. And so the server, that information is then used to update the database accordingly. So say if, going back to the e-commerce example, a user buys something, then obviously that is taken to the server and it's put into the database. So a user made a certain order on a certain time, this was the price. And then, yeah, again, it's a flow, right? So the data goes back to the server and then to the browser. So if the user logs in next time, they'll see the updated profile saying, okay, you've ordered X amount on this date, as you can see. And then you can see below and above the speech bubbles. So what needs to happen when? So your database, it needs to be highly available. So your data basically needs to be, you need to be able to access your data, and users need to be able to see their data very frequently, right? Essentially at any time. So you need to make sure your website is available and have those tools in place to maintain your website to avoid crashes as well. Scalable, so it has to be rendered to many users around the world, especially if you're growing very quickly as a company, or if you offer a global service, again, going back to say Airbnb or PayPal. Latency as well. So my understanding is how long it takes between what is sent to the browser and then what is actually served on the browser to the user. So you want that to be as little as possible, so as less time as possible, right? Because you don't want your users to be waiting around for a very long time. And then, of course, you want the right logic in place so that your users can carry out the certain tasks they need to do. And as a designer, obviously, we need to make sure their needs are met. And then I've got a list of common databases on the right. So MongoDB, Postgres, SQL, and MySQL. There's a difference between relational databases and non-relational databases. So relational databases, typically it's data in a table, and these tables, they're linked together by a common value. So when a developer does, backend developer does a lookup request to find a certain value or a certain row of data, that's how they can do it, because the tables are linked. Essentially, there's data in two tables, so that's how the match is done. And again, that's useful from a design standpoint if you're looking to design a function or a feature whereby the user needs to retrieve specific data to them from a large volume of data very quickly. So whether it's a date something has been sent off, or they want to retrieve data back, say if they going back to, and they say banking example, maybe if they did a bank transfer, they want to see that in the app, the certain day, certain time, the amount that they transferred to who, and that's an example. And then non-relational is where there is no table in the database. Instead, the data is structured just by a hierarchy. I've personally worked with developers who've used more relational databases, so I can't comment too much on the non-relational ones, but yeah, it would be good to understand the difference and understand how data is used from a technical standpoint, so you can factor that into your design decisions. I think I might have a question, so I'll just go to it. Okay, cool. Yeah, Bootstrap, PHP and Bootstrap. Yes, good question. So PHP is backend. Yeah, so it's a different language. You can use C# as well. I think .NET you can use, if I'm not mistaken. C++, that Java as well is a big one. Yep, Node.js, yeah, exactly. So that's what I was referring to earlier when I said on the JavaScript side that JavaScript can be used in the backend as well. So it's useful if you know it. Yeah, Node.js as well. And Bootstrap is basically a way of packaging your front end design, so you can serve it up more easily to users on the front end. So yeah, great comments. Thanks both. Alrighty, so yeah, so that's databases. I'm just going to minimize the chat and then I'll continue. That's weird. I'm having trouble seeing the cursor. Got it. Cool. And then this one. Apology. I must have put that slide in by mistake. But yeah, next one, databases. So common design considerations when it comes to understanding designing for data, right? So I've linked to a Medium article below about designing for data. So again, you can look through that in your own time once you get the slides. Very interesting, recommend it. But on your right, there are some things to consider. So your open web kind of security, application security principles. There are top 10 principles, which are very interesting. And they basically, to summarize, cover things like hacking. So how if someone tries to brute force your application and steal your user data, obviously that's not good. And from a design perspective, you need to be aware of that. So when it comes to designing your user experience, you can help design and kind of inform users to say, well, firstly, pick a password that is less likely to be hacked, so very strong, but then also send timely reminders, notifications to kind of change their password, etc. And say when you're designing something like multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, again, that's going to be add that extra protective layer, so email and password or secret code, and then that way it's harder for your user's account to be hacked, their information to be stolen, etc. So that's an example of one of the principles, but yeah, there are 10 of them, so I really recommend you looking at that. Privacy by design, so that's quite interesting. I've seen this more in healthcare and finance, but it's basically giving your users kind of notifications or updates that are relevant and timely to them, but that don't enable their privacy to be violated or that update or notification to be seen by others. So an example is if you're working on a healthcare app and you're reminding your user, okay, you have to take a certain medicine for a certain condition, it's designing that in a way that it's not just going to flash up on their screen when, say, they're in the middle of a meeting, or because you don't want your users kind of medical confidentiality to be violated, right? Because there are legal implications for that. And then also I heard as well that it's also trying to make sure that your users, say partners or other family members, assuming they're above kind of legal adult age, they're not allowed to show to have their information shown to other people, whether they're kind of partners, etc., because their medical data is specific to them. So doing so could constitute kind of a legal violation, data breach, etc. So it's important from a design perspective to be mindful of that and to design around that. Yeah, really interesting stuff. And then third is ethics. So are you designing an experience that uses data, especially when you're designing for AI, but designing it in a way where it's easily explainable to the user so they can understand easily how their data is being used, what's going to happen, why they're being shown that data, and then also transparent. So an example would be like GDPR. So what's going to happen to the data? How is it used in terms of data controller, data processing, their rights to their data? Can they delete data? All of that sort of thing, opting into privacy, terms and conditions. That's important to be mindful of when you're designing. And the fourth is common design patterns. So some really good general design pattern websites are Patent App patterns as well, and they show some very tried and tested design kind of patterns and components when it comes to trying to design and think of certain scenarios or features that your user has to go through, especially when it comes to data. So you just have to go to those websites, type in your keywords like data or dashboard, information visualization, and they'll come up, and you can get a really good sense of how to design for heavy data visualization. So I'll just stop here and check the chat. Oh, recently launched a course on design by data. Yeah, very exciting. Have a look. Just want to make sure everything's clear. Has anyone got any questions? If not, I'll keep going. Ooh, can you design for protected routes versus unprotected routes? Ooh, that's a very good question. When you say protected and unprotected, what do you mean by that specifically? So I'll just wait for you to reply. I think if you mean, just that data can be accessed, logged in versus not logged in. Okay, admin versus non-admin. Okay. Yeah, so this actually comes back, really good question. This comes back to it's one of the principles, the top 10 principles. So you want to design for your least privileged user, or assume the least access possible. So no one should have more access or rights than they need to. So if you look at, for example, designing a workforce tool, a manager or a team lead, they're going to have more admin rights than their team members, right? Because they have to carry out certain roles that for their team members. So maybe looking at their workload, doing an annual review, or writing an appraisal that their team members don't. So when you're designing, say that application, and you've got multiple users or user personas, those team leads, those team members, you're not going to design for them and give them the same access for them that you would for the team lead or manager. So yeah, really good question. Thank you for bringing that up, and hopefully that answers it. And yeah, please do check out the principles. How far should designers go into learning about development? I mean, at the end of the day, it's up to you, right? It's your journey, it's your career. I think having an understanding of the basics is really good to really understand your developers, work well with them, just be technically literate. And it's not just developers too, it's the QA engineers or the testers, it's technical BAs. Just being able to have more awareness and spot any potential roadblocks technically in your designs earlier, that's really beneficial. So I would recommend having an understanding of the basics that I covered in my previous slides for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That would be really useful. And checking out those resources I sent, they'll give you a good overview, because they have the interactive code pens that you can play around in. So that will enable you to pick things up very quickly. Cool. So moving on to accessibility now. So you've got a good overview of front end, back end, but it's not enough to design for, I guess, the majority, or what we think is the majority. We need to be able to design for people from a variety of different backgrounds, right? We need to be inclusive, and that's where accessibility comes in. So Slido's not working, but so write in the chat. But when you think of accessibility, what do you think of? And when you think of inclusive design, what does that mean to you? So I'll give you a few moments to write your answers in the chat. So 2 questions, what is accessibility, and then what is inclusive design? Cool, let's see the chat. Design of products, devices, services, or environments for people with disabilities. Yeah, really good answer. Including disabled people can use, ADA compliant. Yeah, makes sense. The American Disabilities Act, right? Yeah, so different countries will have different legislations and call it different things, but yeah, I mean, that's right. Yeah, well done. Cool. All right, anyone else? And when you say products, devices, services, yeah, with disabilities. Okay, nice. So do you want to be more specific in terms of people with disabilities as well? What do you envisage when you say that? Enabling disabled people can use accessibility. Yeah. Cool. For example, use patterns over colors. Yeah, really good. So that would be for someone with visual impairment, right? If they maybe don't see colors correctly, and there are different types of color issues as well. So it's not just red-green blindness, which I think a lot of people think of, but it's also not seeing blues correctly, yellows correctly, blurring as well. So yeah, there are a variety of different visual impairments specific to color, and there are a variety of different visual impairments as well. Cool. Cool. All right, we'll stop it here in terms of the chat, and I'll keep going. But yeah, we've all got the gist of what we mean by accessibility and inclusive design. So yeah, really great work. Okay, I'm just gonna close the chat. Okay. I can't seem to. Oh, here it is. Toolbar's back. Cool. All right. Oh. What just happened? Okay, I'll just log in. That's very weird. Okay, I'll just share my screen again. And I'll be back with you. It's timed out for some reason. Cool. Alrighty, we're back. Share screen. Oh, it's not sharing. Okay, let's try that again. Alrighty. Right, we're back in business. Cool. So accessibility. Essentially, there are five main types of accessibility. So you've got visual, hearing, motor, and cognitive. You also have, well, smell to an extent, but in terms of inclusive design, these are the 4 you focus on. So visual, so sighted, hearing is auditory, motor for people with conditions that make it hard for them to mobilize effectively, and then cognitive, that's inclusive of certain learning disabilities. So in order to make your designs effectively usable by people with disabilities, they have to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So what does that mean exactly? Perceivable is more around the users should be able to see your designs, interact with your designs easily. So it's not invisible, your designs. They can easily access, say, information, kind of alerts, scrolling features, etc. They're served as and when, and the users can interact with them without any problems with their assistive technologies. Operable, again, that is touched upon before, but users can use the technologies they have to go about carrying out their task, what they need to do through the assistive technologies. For example, could be if they're using a screen reader on a website, so the website is coded in a way wherein users can, if they're using a screen reader, they can just hear what is being read to them, because the screen reader is going to speak whatever is coded, right, and read out kind of the layout of the website to them. And then understandable is the product or service or the website is written and is designed in a way that the information is easily understood, and what the tasks that can be carried out, what the product or service can do for the user is easily understandable. So that entails things like avoiding complex jargon, easy sentences, your layout as well, enough white space so the content is easily digestible, kind of icons, color is used effectively to point to certain, say, videos or other types of media to enable understanding as well. And then robust is whereby you want to future-proof your designs. So because technology is always updating, and there'll be more accessible technology in the future, and the specs will become more efficient and they'll be optimized. So you want your mobile app, your desktop, your website, etc., whatever it is you're designing, to work and integrate with as many different types of assistive technology as possible. So that's something to bear in mind. So when it comes to accessibility testing later down the line, you want to test with these types, this wide variety of types of assistive technologies, and also with differently abled users across the spectrum of people with different impairments, right? Does that make sense? Or does anyone have any questions so far? I think I saw one about where can a developer get this job. So if you're looking at accessibility kind of testing and accessible development, I think especially if you're more junior, going for a first job, looking at trying to champion accessible design, development, and differently abled users, I think that would be really good, because then you can focus more on learning and growing your career more in this domain, right? And then you'll have the skills and the knowledge relevant to this. Cool. And then here I've just got some resources as well. So your we call it WCAG, but it's basically your world accessibility guidelines. We're currently in version 2.1, but there is a draft as of 25th of January for 2.2. And I've also linked the UK government guidelines, because all government services have to be accessible and they have to meet a certain rating, and there are different types of ratings here. So it's A, AA, or AAA. So it'd be useful to and interesting to understand that for you. And then also there's something called the accessibility project. This A11Y is shorthand for accessibility. And again, they've got loads of resources and helpful information about accessibility testing, how to recruit differently abled users when it comes to doing your user research, because you want to have those types of users in for your user personas, user interviews, etc., and so on and so forth. So you really want to start as early as possible in discovery when it comes to ensuring that your design is accessible as possible. Cool. And then here I've just got some examples of different types of disabilities, because they can be permanent, temporary, and situational. And of course, as I mentioned, there are different types of impairments. So you can see here the different scenarios that your users might find themselves in, and therefore your considerations of how you're going to design your product and service, that's going to be different depending on the situation that your users would find themselves in. So it's really important to be mindful of that. And it's also important to be aware that designing for people with different kind of abilities and impairments, that really opens the door to innovation. So I read that Google Maps was, I think, initially born out of a hackathon, and I think it was for people with visual impairments because of the voice control feature. But now so many people use voice control when they're driving, right? Because it's hands-free. And it's so common. So it just goes to show that designing inclusively and designing accessibility first, that's really like a really good thing. And it's so useful because it's not only helpful for people with impairments, but also people who don't have impairments, right? So it benefits everyone. Cool. And then here I've got some information, some infographics about from the government.uk website about how to do's and don'ts for designing for people with impairments. So if you're visually impaired versus cognitively impaired here, you can find these online, and again in the PDF that will be sent over. And then for those with motor or physical disabilities, hearing impairments as well, dyslexia, etc. Cool. So any questions so far? Or is that pretty self-explanatory? Cool. I don't see any questions, so I will continue. Cool. Cool. And then regards to, as I mentioned, accessibility testing and inclusive development. So once you have once you've designed your wireframes inclusively, your product or service needs to be coded in such a way that it's also inclusive, right? So it can be used with people, say, who use screen readers, etc., or maybe need closed captioning. And how does that happen? Well, that's through something called ARIA, so accessible rich interface applications. And Mozilla, I've linked here, has got some really good documentation, as well as the UK government, around how to set that up. But basically it's writing and sectioning your websites in a way, or products and services in a way that they are easily, what is written in terms of the syntax it can be easily picked up by the assistive technology, and therefore be played back and operable for the user, for them to continue on with their journey and carry out the tasks they need to do. So you've got certain roles like navigation as well, or like header, banner, etc., that needs to be defined, because when this video is a screen reader, but when the screen reader picks it up, the user, they know how the website is laid out. So an example is if they're tabbing through the navigation at the top, and they come through to a link, how it's read on the screen reader, it won't say just link. It will say the name of the link and basically where it's going to, so the user knows that this is the link they need to carry out their task and get to where they need to go and to continue their journey. I've linked this video here. It's about 10 minutes. Really interesting. You can see here in the screen grab that they're tabbing through, the user's tabbing through. So you see this rectangle here and this highlighted text, closed captioning as well. It's a good example of alt text, which is what you need when it comes to images and making sure that a user with impairments, they know what's going on in terms of the image being displayed to them. So yeah, really good example of inclusive design and development and testing. And if you've got no other questions regarding this slide, we can move on. If you've got questions in general you'd like to ask.
Hi, Arka.
Hello.
Hi. So I would like to thank you, first of all. This was a very insightful and a brief session that we had. Before we go ahead with the Q&A session, I'd like to take a couple of minutes, because we have something that we want to introduce to our learners.
Okay, sure.
Something that we have recently started in terms of enhancing learning design. So we have recently started with this thing called ProSchool. Okay, so I would like to tell everyone that ProSchool is basically a UI UX design training school to help designers get trained, intern, and even work full time. So we are currently offering a 6-month extensive UI UX design training program where 4 months you will be taught by industry experts and mentors to help you gain a more in-depth knowledge on UI and UX. And the next 2 months you will be working as an intern with India's leading design agency called ProCreator. So this internship would be in regards to, help you get the skills, the experience, the confidence that you need to work professionally. So this is something that we have been recently working on, and we have introduced it, and you can find it everywhere on the platform, on the app. And I'll also be posting the link in the chat box. So, you can just fill up the form there and we will reach out to you with more details around the curriculum. And so, yeah, we can surely start with the Q&A session, Arka. I am hoping it would be pretty interactive for us. So let's get started with that. So guys, if you have any questions or maybe anything that you would like to know in depth, or you need a better insight, you can definitely shoot up your questions in the Q&A session, and there would be a specific chat box for that you would see on your screen, so that we can help you identify your questions as well.
Yes, and thank you everyone for all your insightful questions, being really interactive, as well as your patience when my keynote timed out halfway through. Really engaging and insightful questions.
That's right. Yeah, it was a very interactive session, to be honest, and that was pretty in brief. So I'm sure it was very, helpful for the attendees as well.
Yeah.
So there's Hadassah saying thanks for all the information. Much appreciated. Welcome. Thank you for joining. Yeah.
Yes, the links I've linked to in my slides, videos as well, and there are tutorials that you can do. So I think that will be really useful to do in your own time. I mean, obviously I couldn't cover everything, but there are very interesting things. My question is, we've got a question, what is a good process to help teams work together to cover all these aspects in design? I think that's a large question. I think it's just a case of knowing your team members really well, and understanding what they like and dislike in terms of how they like to work, and what they like working on. because at the end of the day, it comes down to collaboration. It's not only trying to get your users on board with what you're designing, but it's also your team members on board with what you're designing for the users. So I think just bringing everyone along and learning from each other. So like, for example, maybe developers, you could sit down with developers and teach them a bit about UX, right? About kind of front end, about how you design, say, a component library, because that's relevant maybe to what they're coding. But equally, they could sit down and teach you about front end development or back end development to help you become more technically minded as a designer. And then again, maybe going together on user interviews with sighted users or people with impairments like that, to help make sure your designs are more inclusive and accessible. So I think it's just really making time for each other and space for each other.
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. And
Okay.
so for complete quick apps, what templates or tools do you use? That's the question.
Ooh, templates or tools. So I think Figma is industry standard, but they've got a lot of templates that I've seen. There's Sketch resources as well, that's got a lot of tools, templates, but I mean, Sketch, a lot of people now I've seen are preferring Figma, so maybe you don't use Sketch, I don't know. There's patterns and pattern tat as well, which is good. I'll see if I'll just write it here in the chat. I think it's this, and then I think it's pattern tat. I can't remember if it's got a hyphen or not, but they're also good ones in terms of understanding design patterns, because they act as templates, right, when it comes to designing things quickly.
So we have another question. It reads, I design websites in 10 minutes using Beaver Builder. What would I do for a quick app? Is there a service or a tool to use templates?
Not sure. I mean, I'd say 10 minutes is pretty fast already.
Fast.
I guess the ones that I mentioned, to be honest, because they have when you download the files, they're in different formats depending on the tool you use. So you don't necessarily have to build things from scratch, and they're easily accessible. So I'd probably say the ones that I mentioned. But I know you've got, it depends on also what you're looking for. So like illustrations, Blush I've heard is good as well as humans. So again, it just depends what specifically you're after. For open source fonts, you can use Google fonts, and like Sky fonts as well. So it just depends.
So any more questions from our learners, from our attendees we would like to ask? In the meantime, I have also shared the link for, for the website of ProSchool. You can go through the website. I've shared in the chat box. I have also shared a link for Arka's LinkedIn. You can connect. Guys, are there any more questions?
I guess not, from the looks of it.
Okay, yeah.
Something
in the chat. It was nice meeting you too. Yeah, this is for you, Arka.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for joining, guys.
Yeah. Well,
I guess everyone has loved this session in terms of in-depth knowledge. So thank you for joining. This was something that we were looking forward to.
Yes, of course. There's a question for you though, actually. It says, I'm a Premier subscriber to ProApp. Do I need to pay extra for ProSchool?
We have certain things. Yes, it's something that we have specifically designed, in terms of in-depth learning for a certification as well. So you would be certified on the basis of the education that you would be receiving. So yes, there are more details about this. I have shared the link in the chat box. You can go through the website. You can, register yourself to enroll, and then someone with our team would definitely get back to you in regards to that. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions. So I guess we should, or we can wrap up this session.
Yeah.
So I would like to thank you all, and even you, Arka, for joining for this insightful session. It was a wonderful session. I guess there was a lot of interaction. So I guess
Mm.
we have achieved what we were planning to. Yeah. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a good evening. Yeah. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.